hella busy day today. Don't really have a clear image in my mind, but this is a rant, so I don't need one. It occurred to me today that one of the problems that we have is in thinking things that are easy are hard, and thinking things that are hard are important. And so things should be hard. Some things shouldn't be hard. And this manifests in all kinds of ways. People use stupid language or they tie things together, that you would never tie together, right? You'd never look at something like Microsoft and say, well, their software's pretty good. No, no, it's not. Right. And I mean, you could be forgiven for thinking that it is if you hadn't engaged with stable operating systems, right? Or well-designed word processing and spreadsheet software. And it's harder to see now because they've gotten better. But, when you've been doing it wrong for 20 years and you finally get it right, like, I'm not impressed. Sorry, I'm not impressed. Like, should have gotten it right sooner, especially when there were better examples. Or, a lot of people don't know this. I get that. But, like, also, you should be paying attention. Every time Microsoft buys a company, they destroy the software. And, that's that. Like, they just wreck it. Every time they get into a competitive industry, right? Because they were a monopoly and they had help from IBM and Intel for years. Every time they get in a competitive industry, bang, they just completely lose it. They lose it every time. And again, like, yeah, if you didn't see it, you didn't see it. But this is why history is important, right? You bring a bunch of people into an industry, say software engineering, for example, just to pick a random example that I know nothing about. And they don't know the history. So now, I was thinking about this today. Like, suppose I'm interviewing a senior software engineer who needs to work at the level of, at least understanding algorithms. Maybe they don't have to write any, but maybe they have to know something about algorithms, right? This is software engineering now. This isn't script kiddie garbage. It's not web programming. It's not, it's not DevOps gluing integration and automation. Automation is not software engineering. Automation is automation. And yeah, you have to be a good process engineer to do good automation engineering. But also you can do automation without knowing any engineering. It's not that hard. You're just gluing pieces together that other people wrote. Maybe using some variables and recursion to get really fancy, whatever. It's cool. It's fine, right? And maybe you do that in Golang, but you never use any of the parallelization Golang features correctly because, we've seen that. But what if you need somebody who's an actual software engineer, right? Like, I need a software engineer, somebody who understands algorithms. And I sit down in the interview and I say, so, you're here to interview for this senior software position or maybe software architect, do you like Sedgwick better or Tenenbaum? And they go, huh? Then the interview's over. It's over. It's absolutely over. Okay. Now, if they say, well, I don't know who Sedgwick and Tenenbaum are, but I'm familiar with, and they give me some name I don't know, because there's no doubt that I don't know all the names of all the, we'll say, giants of algorithms and explaining algorithms since Sedgwick and Tenenbaum when I studied this sort of thing, then we can continue to have a discussion. But if you're not familiar with them and you don't put up an alternative, then really we're done. That's pretty easy. Like, we're done. If you haven't studied algorithms, I can't hire you for a job that requires knowledge of algorithms. I'm not going to wait for you to learn your way into it. Most people can't learn how algorithms work. And you can say, oh, that's not true, Mark, blah, 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 blah. Oh, yeah? Look at all the people on YouTube who tell you how the YouTube algorithm works. Are absolutely wrong about how algorithms work. Look at all the people saying, it's the algo, bro. Okay, it cannot ever be the algo. Algorithms rely entirely on the data you feed them. It's always two variables. Always. It will never not be two variables, ever. Minimum. Right? It's never the algorithm. If you interact with the algorithm, you have an effect on the algorithm. Sorry. It's part of that world, right? So you can't blame the algorithm for the things that happen to you entirely. It's not to say that algorithms aren't terrible and never do their job correctly, because that's also true. But maybe they do a job you don't understand, or maybe the algorithm's not broken, but the data being fed in is, because that happens more often, way more often, actually. A lot of times, a brilliant person will develop an algorithm, leave the company, and then somebody changes something about the ingested data, maybe expands it, and then starts to look for different ways of manipulating that data that the algorithm actually doesn't support, or worse yet, makes difficult, because that happens all the time too. A good senior software engineer would at least be able to see something like that, even if they couldn't fix the algorithm. And fair enough, like, algorithm guys are hard, and you're not going to get a lot of them. But also, you have to know that, and you don't want to hire some automation engineer to do algorithms, right? And there's a ton of other skills, like, if you're hiring a software architect, you need to ask them what their approach to architecture is. Right? There's not one answer to this question, not one. There are several good ones, but you should at least know a few of them. And if they give you one and you're not familiar with that, maybe you give them a try. But if they don't give you one, then there's a problem. Like, don't hire them. Like, why is this hard? It doesn't have to be hard. And if you're not familiar enough with algorithms to know at least about Sedgwick and Tenenbaum and their wonderful books on, algorithms and data structures or algorithms in C, then maybe you shouldn't be hiring that kind of person. Maybe you should outsource that to somebody. Because just hiring people and going, what have you worked on, right? Look, a lot of times, look, there's dishonest people. There's a ton of dishonest people. Way too many in the software industry, have been for 20 years now. But that's not the big problem. The big problem is a lot of people that think they did stuff that they didn't do. You can hire a senior architect who's never actually done any senior architecture work. And if you don't know what questions to ask and what answers to listen for, because questions don't give you answers, and answering a question, if it doesn't match some template, doesn't mean the answer's wrong. It just doesn't. So you can ask the easy questions and get understandable answers. And if you're sophisticated enough, you can know whether or not their answer is acceptable, not correct according to some grading schedule. And this is why I don't like tests. Tests are extraordinarily subjective, like ridiculously subjective, and they're just not helpful. And the number of times I've been interviewed by people and the interviewer didn't actually have their information correct is stunning. They weren't qualified to interview me. Not that they weren't required to hire me. They weren't qualified to interview me, because it just turned out they didn't know what they were talking about. I remember down here in Charleston, South Carolina, years ago, I interviewed for a job. They were doing high data throughput work, which is, one of my specialties. I'm like, ooh, big data, like real big data though, like actual big data, not I'm processing 30,000 transactions a minute. No, it was bigger. It was big. It was beautiful. It looked beautiful. It was a military contract. And the guy's interviewing me, and I'm having a wonderful interview, and he switches me over to senior software engineer. Now, it's a DevOps job. Whatever. Like, I am a senior software engineer. I'm not here for that, because I don't like coding for other people. I hate the way other people do their code. I hate the way they set up their development environments, and I hate the way they do their programming process. It just doesn't match the way I code most comfortably and most efficiently, right? And best for me. And so what happened was, he started asking me these questions, and I had to dig in my brain a little bit and prepare myself. Like when you think like a DevOps engineer, it's a totally different type of thinking than when you think like a software engineer, because you have different tools and you're working from a different perspective, and you have a different goal, right? You have different sets of goals. So he's asking me, well, what are the ways to put a lock on a thread? And I'm like, semaphores, and I forgot mutexes, but I mentioned a couple of other things, and he's like, oh yeah, good, that's really smart. And I'm sitting there like, dude, I'm gonna write this code for you. Like, I'm looking at him like, why is this relevant? I I'm not here for that job, right? Like, I'm not doing that. I'm gonna go work with this other guy I just had a great interview with. And then he asked me a question about high performance computing, and he said, what would you use? So I'm like, oh, okay, what would you use? This is an interesting question all of a sudden. For high speed in memory data manipulation. And I listed a couple of options off the top of my head that, pretty standard fare for C programmers. And he said, what about mmap? And I went like this. And I'm like, I don't know that mmap's, right for that application that you described. And he's like, oh, well, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't get the job, which is fine. Like, it was in Charleston. Charleston's 2 hours from here, one way. I didn't get the job. I came home and I'm like, look, I don't pretend like off the top of my head I know how to write code. I don't write code that way ever. I might script that way. I might write automation that way, but I don't sit there and go, I'm gonna write some software today and start typing. That's dumb. It's actually the wrong way to do it. It's very bad. It's bad for you. It's bad for your software. It's bad for the world. Don't do it. So I'm like, mmap maps files from disk directly into memory, but it doesn't guarantee that it will be in memory. So you're going to do disk swapping for large sets. But maybe I'm misremembering. So I get home and I look it up, and nope, I remembered it correctly. And I'm like, oh, that guy, he's going to have a problem if he uses mmap, because I don't think he understands how mmap works. And, some of my other answers were, you use straight memcopy. We just copies pointers instead of actual memory addresses, right? It doesn't duplicate memory and things like that. So if he's going to use mmap, it isn't going to work, because he's going to have high data throughput. It's going to hit the disk. Everything's going to slow down to a crawl, because it's going to get like 1,000x slower or something crazy. Depends on the system, right? But it's going to get orders of magnitude slower all of a sudden for a bunch of new data while it loads that data into memory. And then if you need any of the other data, now it's flushed. Oops. I'm not saying you can't use mmap very effectively, and there's plenty of ways to do that. This guy, you aren't going to be able to do that. And he's interviewing me, and that isn't even the job. And then I didn't get the job, and I have no idea why. I would have, it sounded like a fun job. I was all excited. I'm like, oh, fun. Performance work. I love performance work. I love analysis and performance and setting up, cool development process systems. That's all fun. Although modern CI/CD is just garbage, but that's mostly because we have a bunch of people who were hired on, do you know Git? Who cares if you know Git? Git's a tiny tool with a handful of crappy commands. The question is, do you know how to set up a Git workflow that works for a given development team? Because there's not one way to use Git. There's like 3 or 4 really good ways to use Git. And then there's a bunch of ways that will not work, by the way, because they're conflicting process flows. Can be a problem. Anyway, I figured I'd start there. Like, don't make the simple hard, and don't revere hard things for their own sake. I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty straightforward. And keep in mind, like, half the people are below average IQ, man. And it's hard to find good people. Don't get fooled by being surrounded by good people thinking that everyone is as good as your team, because that's not true.